Found wires in my jacket lining. Plugged them into my computer. A whole year of recordings. Every conversation, every phone call, even what I said to my wife in bed. And she said, I just wanted to stay informed. You know that feeling when something's been off for months, but you can't put your finger on it? That's where I was 3 weeks ago. My mother-in-law had been acting weird around me. Not the usual passive-aggressive weird that comes with the territory, but genuinely strange. She'd get this look in her eyes whenever I walked into her room, like she knew something I didn't. She'd make these little comments that seemed innocent enough but felt loaded with meaning. The whole thing started making sense when I was getting ready for work last Tuesday morning. I grabbed my navy blazer from the closet, the one I wear to important meetings, the one my wife bought me for our anniversary 2 years ago. As I was putting it on, I felt something unusual in the lining near the chest pocket. At first, I thought it was just a loose thread, or maybe the padding had shifted, but when I pressed against it, I could feel something hard underneath the fabric. I didn't think much of it initially. Jackets get worn out. Things happen. But throughout the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. During lunch, I kept touching that spot on my chest, feeling whatever was hidden there. By the time I got home, I was determined to figure out what it was. That evening, while my wife was in the shower, I took the jacket to my home office and turned it inside out. What I found made my blood run cold. There, carefully sewn into the lining with thread that almost perfectly matched the original, was a small rectangular device no bigger than a matchbox. Thin wires ran from it to what looked like a tiny microphone positioned right where my chest would be when wearing the jacket. My hands were shaking as I carefully cut the threads and removed the device. It was clearly some kind of recording equipment, professional looking, not the kind of thing you'd find at a regular electronics store. The worst part was how expertly it had been installed. Someone had taken great care to make sure it was completely hidden, someone who knew exactly what they were doing. I sat there staring at this thing for what felt like hours, my mind racing through possibilities. Who had access to my jacket? Who would want to record my conversations? And then it hit me like a punch to the gut. 3 months ago, my mother-in-law had offered to take some of our clothes to be dry cleaned. She'd specifically mentioned my blazer, saying it looked like it needed professional care. I'd thought nothing of it at the time. She was just being helpful, or so I believed. The device had a small USB port, so I connected it to my laptop. What I found there destroyed any remaining doubt about who was behind this. File after file of audio recordings, dating back almost exactly 3 months. The timestamps corresponded perfectly with when I'd worn that jacket. Every important work meeting, every lunch with colleagues, every phone conversation I did while wearing it, all of it was there. But the recordings that made me physically sick were the personal ones. Conversations with my wife about our marriage problems, discussions about our finances, even intimate moments when I'd whispered things to her while getting dressed in the morning. Someone had been listening to the most private aspects of my life for months. I spent the entire night going through the files, and with each recording, my anger grew. There were conversations about my concerns regarding my mother-in-law's increasing involvement in our marriage, discussions about how uncomfortable her constant presence made me feel, and worst of all, recordings of me telling my wife that I thought her mother was trying to control our relationship. The next morning, I confronted my mother-in-law directly. I didn't beat around the bush or try to be diplomatic. I walked into her kitchen, she lives just 2 blocks away from us, and placed the device on her table. Her face went completely white, but she didn't deny it. Instead, she looked me straight in the eye and said she just wanted to stay informed about what was happening in her daughter's life. She explained, with shocking calmness, that she'd noticed her daughter seemed unhappy lately and wanted to understand why. She claimed she was protecting her child, making sure I wasn't hiding anything harmful. According to her twisted logic, a mother has the right to know what kind of man her daughter married, and if that meant secretly recording my private conversations for months, then so be it. What made it even worse was learning that she'd been sharing some of these recordings with my wife's sister, discussing my conversations and analyzing my words for signs of what she called concerning behavior. 2 grown women have been sitting around dissecting my private thoughts and conversations like I was some kind of specimen under a microscope. The betrayal cut deeper than I can describe. This woman had sat at our dinner table, smiled at me, made small talk, all while knowing she had recordings of my most private moments stored away. She'd listened to me express vulnerability to my wife, heard me talk about my fears and insecurities, and had used that information to judge me as unworthy of her daughter. Update 1. The situation has gotten so much worse than I could have imagined. After confronting my mother-in-law, I thought the nightmare was over. I was wrong. When I told my wife what her mother had done, I expected shock, outrage, maybe even an apology on her mother's behalf. Instead, I got something I never saw coming. My wife already knew. She'd known for weeks. The conversation we had that night will haunt me for the rest of my life. She sat on our bed, looking anywhere but at me, and admitted that her mother had played her some of the recordings. Not all of them, she claimed, just the ones where I'd talked about feeling suffocated by her family's involvement in our marriage. Her mother had presented these carefully selected clips as evidence that I didn't respect their family, that I was trying to isolate my wife from the people who loved her. But here's the part that really destroyed me. My wife had listened to those recordings and decided her mother was right. She'd heard me expressing normal frustrations about boundaries and privacy, and instead of recognizing them as legitimate concerns, she'd interpreted them as signs that I was the problem in our marriage. The betrayal was complete. Not only had my privacy been violated in the most invasive way possible, but the person I trusted most in the world had been complicit in that violation. She'd allowed her mother to spy on me, had listened to my private thoughts without my knowledge, and had used those stolen moments of vulnerability against me. What hurt most was discovering how long this had been going on in different forms. My wife admitted that her mother had been expressing concerns about me for over a year. Apparently, I was too private, too reluctant to share details about my work and friendships. The fact that I didn't call her mother Mom was seen as a red flag. The way I preferred quiet evenings at home instead of constant family gatherings was interpreted as antisocial behavior. The microphone was just the latest escalation in what had been a systematic campaign to find evidence that I was wrong for their family. My mother-in-law had convinced my wife that a good husband should have nothing to hide, and therefore my desire for privacy was inherently suspicious. I tried explaining how violated I felt, how the recordings had captured moments that were never meant for anyone else's ears. I talked about the conversations with my friends where I discussed personal struggles, the phone calls with my own family where I'd shared private concerns, the intimate moments with my wife that had been reduced to audio files on someone else's computer. None of it seemed to matter. My wife kept coming back to the same argument. If I had nothing to hide, why was I so upset about the recordings? Her mother had raised valid concerns about my behavior, and the recordings had simply confirmed what they already suspected. In her mind, I was the one who had violated their trust by not being completely open about every aspect of my life. The worst part was realizing how many of our recent arguments suddenly made sense. Times when my wife had seemed to know things I'd never told her, conversations where she'd brought up specific concerns that seemed to come out of nowhere. It was all because she'd been listening to recordings of my private life. I felt like I was living in some kind of dystopian nightmare where privacy was a crime and wanting boundaries made me the villain. Every conversation I'd had in that jacket over the past 3 months had been dissected and analyzed by 2 women who'd already decided I was guilty of something. They just needed to find the evidence. The gaslighting was incredible. When I pointed out that secretly recording someone without their consent was illegal, my mother-in-law claimed she was just being a concerned parent. When I explained how the recordings had violated my privacy with friends and family members who had no idea they were being recorded, my wife said I was being dramatic. I realized that no matter what evidence I presented, no matter how clearly I explained the violation, I was never going to be seen as the victim in this situation. In their minds, I was the problem that needed to be solved, and the recordings were just a tool to help them understand how to fix me. Update 2. I never thought I'd be writing another update, but life has a way of surprising you. It's been 2 months since I discovered the microphone, and everything has changed in ways I couldn't have predicted. The breaking point came 3 weeks after my last update. I was trying to work things out with my wife, going to great lengths to be more open and communicative, hoping we could rebuild the trust that had been shattered. I thought maybe if I proved that I had nothing to hide, we could move past this nightmare. Then I found the second device. This one wasn't in my clothing. It was in our bedroom, hidden inside the alarm clock on my side of the bed. Same professional installation, same type of recording equipment, but this one had been there much longer. The files went back almost 2 years, capturing not just conversations, but intimate sounds, private moments between my wife and me that should never have been recorded. When I confronted my wife with this discovery, something in her face told me she knew about this one too. The elaborate act of surprise she put on was almost insulting. But what came next was worse than I could have imagined. She broke down and admitted that the bedroom surveillance had been her idea. Her mother had suggested it months after we got married, claiming that the best way to understand relationship problems was to observe natural behavior when people thought they were alone. My wife had initially refused, But after a particularly difficult period in our marriage last year, she'd agreed to let her mother install the device. 2 years. For 2 years, my most intimate moments had been recorded and reviewed by my mother-in-law. Every vulnerable conversation, every time I'd comforted my wife during difficult periods, every private moment of our marriage had been turned into data for her mother's analysis. But the final straw came when I learned about the family meetings. Every few weeks, my wife, her mother, and her sister had been getting together to review selected recordings and discuss my behavior. They called them check-ins, but they were essentially tribunals where my actions and words were judged by people who believed they had the right to monitor my life. My wife's sister later admitted that she'd been uncomfortable with the whole thing but had gone along with it because she trusted her mother's judgment. She'd heard recordings of me talking to friends about feeling overwhelmed by my wife's family, and instead of recognizing these as normal relationship challenges, they'd been interpreted as evidence that I was trying to isolate my wife. The most devastating revelation was that major decisions in our marriage had been influenced by these recordings. My wife's sudden resistance to moving to a different city for my career, her insistence that we spend every holiday with her family, even her reluctance to start having children. All of it had been shaped by her mother's interpretations of my recorded conversations. I realized I hadn't been living in a marriage. I'd been living in a surveillance state where every word I spoke was subject to review and judgment by people who'd already decided I was guilty of something. The legal implications were staggering. What they'd done wasn't just a violation of privacy, it was criminal. Recording someone without consent, especially in private spaces like a bedroom, violated multiple laws. But pursuing legal action would mean destroying not just my marriage, but potentially sending my wife and her mother to prison. I couldn't do it. Despite everything they'd put me through, I couldn't bring myself to take legal action against the woman I'd once loved enough to marry. Instead, I made a different choice. I packed my things and left. Not just the house, but the entire situation. I couldn't remain in a relationship where my privacy had been violated so fundamentally, where trust had been shattered so completely that I questioned every interaction I'd had for years. Final update. It's been 6 months since I walked away, and I'm writing this final update from my new apartment in a different state. I need to close this chapter of my life, both for my own healing and for anyone who might find themselves in a similar situation. The hardest part wasn't the divorce proceedings or dividing our assets. It was accepting that the woman I'd married had been a stranger for most of our relationship. Every moment of intimacy, every vulnerable conversation, every private struggle I'd shared with her had been filtered through her mother's judgment. I'd been married to someone who'd never really known me because she'd been seeing me through someone else's interpretation of secretly recorded conversations. My wife tried to contact me repeatedly during the first few months. She wanted to explain, to justify, to somehow make me understand that their actions had been motivated by love and concern. She couldn't comprehend why I saw their behavior as a fundamental violation of trust rather than an expression of caring. Her mother, meanwhile, had convinced half their extended family that I was the villain in this story. According to the version of events she'd spread, I'd left my wife because I couldn't handle a close-knit family, because I was too selfish to accept that people who loved her wanted to be involved in her life. The irony was incredible. The woman who'd secretly recorded my private conversations for years was painting me as the one with trust issues. But something unexpected happened about 4 months after I left. My wife's sister reached out to me. She'd been feeling increasingly uncomfortable about the whole situation and had finally confronted her mother about the ethics of what they'd done. The conversation had revealed the true extent of the surveillance. It wasn't just me they'd been monitoring. My mother-in-law had been recording conversations with all her daughter's partners for years. My wife's sister discovered that her own husband had been subjected to similar surveillance, though not as extensively as I had been. The woman had turned monitoring her children's relationships into a systematic operation, convincing herself that she was protecting them from making poor choices. Learning this changed everything for my wife's sister. She realized that what she dismissed as excessive concern was actually controlling behavior that had damaged multiple relationships. She'd watched her mother drive away partners who didn't meet her impossible standards of openness and submission to family authority. My wife's sister divorced her husband shortly after this revelation, but for different reasons than mine. She realized that her marriage had been shaped by her mother's manipulations and wanted to start fresh without that influence. Her husband, thankfully, had been largely unaware of the surveillance and chose to work with her on rebuilding their relationship without her mother's involvement. My wife, however, couldn't make that choice. Even after learning about the extent of her mother's surveillance of other family members, she continued to defend her mother's actions. She genuinely believed that parents had the right to monitor their adult children's relationships to protect them from harm. The fact that this monitoring included recording intimate moments and private conversations didn't change her perspective. I realized then that this wasn't just about privacy or trust. It was about fundamental differences in how we viewed autonomy and relationships. To me, love requires trust, and trust requires respect for boundaries. To her, love justified any level of intrusion if it was motivated by concern. The divorce was finalized last month. I didn't seek revenge or try to expose what they'd done publicly. I simply wanted to move forward with my life and rebuild my sense of security and privacy. The legal proceedings were straightforward since I had extensive documentation of the surveillance devices and recordings. I've had to work hard to trust people again. For months, I found myself checking my clothes for hidden devices, examining electronics in my home, feeling paranoid about every conversation. The violation had changed how I interacted with the world, making me question whether the people around me were genuine in their interactions. But gradually, I've started to heal. I've built new friendships with people who respect boundaries and understand that privacy isn't about having something to hide. It's about having the right to control who has access to your thoughts and feelings. I've learned to recognize red flags in relationships, signs that someone might not respect the basic boundaries that healthy relationships require. I'm not sharing this story to get sympathy or to vilify my ex-wife and her family. I'm sharing it because I believe that what happened to me could happen to anyone. And I want people to understand that this level of surveillance and control isn't normal or acceptable, regardless of the claimed motivations. If someone in your life insists on monitoring your conversations, accessing your private communications, or installing surveillance equipment in your home, those are not expressions of love or concern. They're violations of your fundamental right to privacy and autonomy. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong, even if the people around you are trying to convince you that your discomfort is unreasonable. I've learned that some betrayals are too fundamental to overcome. When someone violates your privacy so completely and systematically, when they turn your most vulnerable moments into evidence against you, the relationship can't be repaired. Sometimes the healthiest choice is to walk away and start over. Today, I'm building a new life based on genuine trust and mutual respect. I'm dating someone who understands that healthy relationships require boundaries, who would never dream of monitoring my conversations or invading my privacy. It's taken time to believe that such relationships are possible, but they are. To anyone who finds themselves in a similar situation, you deserve privacy, you deserve trust, and you deserve relationships where your boundaries are respected. Don't let anyone convince you that love justifies surveillance or that wanting privacy makes you suspicious. Your instincts about what feels wrong are probably right, and you have the power to choose relationships that honor your dignity and autonomy. That's all I have to say about this chapter of my life. I'm closing the book on this experience and focusing on the future I'm building for myself, one based on genuine trust and mutual respect.